guys, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Sofia and I like to make the occasional sewing video here on YouTube. Anyway, today I am showing you the process of making a summer dress. I bought this green and white striped cotton fabric at a charity shop for €2 all the way back in the summer of last year, but I never managed to make anything from it. But as soon as I saw this fabric, I had an idea of what I could make from it. I had seen a bunch of these summery cottagecore type of dresses pop up in my Instagram Explore page, which then inspired me to make the first sketch of the dress that I wanted to create. And then that's kind of where I was stuck for a good while, because I wasn't really sure on how to create the patterns and I was too scared to just start cutting up the fabric without knowing if the pieces would actually work or not. Because, you know, I have a finite amount of fabric at my disposal. But then in November of last year, I found a digital McCall's top pattern online that had the exact shape that I had sketched out initially. So I bought it, but at that point it was already winter in Finland, and then in the springtime I went to France as an exchange student for 4 months, so I had to kind of postpone this project. But long story short, I am back in Finland and I am finally ready to start working on the summer dress of my dreams. So without any further ado, let's begin. First up, let's take a quick look at the patterns. The McCall's top came with 4 options, with the instructions being slightly different for each variation. For my summer dress, I decided to combine the body of the option A with the sleeves from option B. After cutting out the fabric pieces necessary for the top, I would then create the skirts with whatever fabric I had left. In my case, this ended up being 126 centimeters by 89 centimeters. I wanted the skirt to be A-lined, but I knew off the bat that I wouldn't have enough fabric to make a circle skirt or even a half circle skirt. So what I decided instead was to cut the remaining rectangle of fabric into triangular pieces, or parallelograms, I guess, so that after turning the pieces around like this, I would be left with a more circular skirt. Now I must point out that this way of cutting the fabric only worked because the right side and the wrong side of my fabric looked pretty much the same, so I was able to turn one of the pieces inside out, basically. But if the wrong side of your fabric looks clearly different from the right side, I think that by adding an additional triangle to the middle would solve this issue. With that explanation out of the way, we can move on to cutting the pattern pieces. I folded one side of the fabric over so that I could cut the back pieces against the fold, and also because some pieces needed to be cut out twice. I then carefully positioned the pattern pieces on the fabric, pinned them in place, and started cutting. After I was done cutting all of the patterns from the stripey fabric, I cut out matching pieces of interfacing for the lower back and lower front pieces. The instructions said to cut out interfacing for the cuffs or sleeve bands as well, but I decided not to do it because the green and white fabric alone was already quite sturdy. Anyways, I proceeded to iron the interfacing pieces and the pattern pieces together. I then measured the fabric I had left for the skirt, marked it with some pins in the right spots, and started cutting it into those angled skirt pieces that I showed you earlier. I also noticed that the fabric started to fray really easily, so I zigzagged all of the edges of my pattern pieces. Now that I'm done prepping all of the pattern pieces, I can finally move on to the actual sewing. My first step is to take these front pieces and the upper back piece and gather the parts I have marked with these pins. So along the top and the bottom of the front pieces and the top and the bottom of the upper back piece. So what I'm gonna do is just sew 2 lines of a straight stitch with a long stitch length parallel to each other without any back stitching, so that I can then pull on the thread to kind of ruche these parts off the top. So here we have the gathered upper back piece and the yoke, which is the top back piece, I guess. And all I'm gonna do is just stitch these two together with the right sides facing each other. And I'm going against the instructions a little bit here because I'm actually supposed to have a second yoke piece to use as the backing, but I didn't have enough fabric for that, so we're just gonna have to go with the one piece. This does mean that we're going to be left with more raw edges on the inside of the dress, but you're not going to be able to see them anyway, so I'm not too worried. Next I'm going to sew the upper front pieces to the back of the top, again with the right sides facing each other. I attached these two pieces with the stitch line going through the two straight lines that I sewed in to create the gathers. After sewing these pieces together, I used my seam ripper to pull out the line of stitches that was visible on the outside. The next step is to stay stitch the neckline from both sides, so from one front piece to the center back of the neck, and from the other piece to that point as well. The main point of this is to prevent any possible stretching in this area of the garments when we're sewing on the collar piece. Now that I've stay stitched the neckline, I'm going to do the same to the long edges of these collar pieces. I cut them on the bias to get this cool diagonal pattern here, but because they're cut on the bias, they're also really prone to stretching, so I want to try and minimize that as best as I can. And after stay stitching the long edges, I'm also going to sew the collar pieces together. Next, I'm ready to attach the collar to the neckline. And to do that, I'm just going to pin it in place with the right sides together, making sure that the center seam of the collar is at the center back of the neck. Because I wanted the collar to be quite narrow, I sewed it on with a large seam allowance. I then cut out the excess fabric so that the collar wouldn't be too bulky. I folded the collar like so and pinned it in place. I then proceeded to slip stitch it in place on the inside of the garment. This step takes a bit of time and patience, but by sewing the collar on by hand, you won't be left with any visible lines of stitches on the outside of the collar. Now that the upper part of the top is pretty much done, I'm going to move on to the lower parts. So here I have the front and the back pieces with the interfacing on the other side. And I'm just gonna sew these pieces together, but just keep them in 3 separate parts for now. Next up, I started working on the Rolo loops, which are these little buttonholes you see here, as well as on these inspiration pics. To make the loops, I grabbed some leftover white cotton fabric, cut it into long strips on the bias, about 4 centimeters wide, and stitched the long edges of the strips, as well as one of the shorter edges. This way I was able to use the straw trick to turn them inside out. To do that, all you need is a drinking straw and something thin enough to fit inside it. You slide the straw inside the fabric tube and start poking the other end through with the stick, and the tube will turn itself inside out. Then I cut the tubes to size, about 8 centimeters each, pressed them flat with the iron, pinned the ends to form the loops, sewed the ends together, and then just cut them loose from each other. And that's how I got all of these tiny little loops. I made 18 of them, but I'm not 100% sure yet how many I'm gonna need, so we're gonna have to see if this is enough. So now I can sew 4 of these loops to the lower front piece. But because I don't have any additional lining pieces, if I were to just sew them on like this, It would leave a really prominent stitch line all down the front, and I don't want that. So what I did was take some of this white cotton fabric and cut out a thin lining piece that I can then use to sandwich these loops inside. So after stitching it all together, the edges will have a nice finish. As I was sewing the loops in place, I went back and forth on the loops just to really make sure that they were securely sewn in. I then understitched the lining and the seam allowance of the stripey fabric together so the front would look nice and polished. After that, I stitched the lining piece in place by sewing it onto the interfacing. With all of the lower parts of the top finished, we are ready to sew these parts together. For the back of the top, I made sure that the centers of the pieces lined up nicely before pinning it in place. And for the fronts, I lined them up so that the collar and the edge of the bottom piece would align nicely. I went ahead and e-stitched the top parts of the sleeves and gathered the bottom of the sleeve, I guess. So now all I have to do is sew the sleeves onto the top. The next thing I'm gonna do is just sew the side seams off the top. I tried the top on at this point just to kind of get a sense of the fit, and it was already looking pretty cool at this point. So I turned the top inside out and pinned the sides to mark where I needed to sew the side seams. Then I took the top to my sewing machine and just stitched along the pins. Now all I have to do is sew the cuffs onto the sleeves and the top part will be finished. I pinned the cuff to the sleeve, and after sewing all around the sleeve, I sewed the open side of the cuff. And again, I undid the stitches from the gathering and the e-stitching. I then flipped the cuff like so, pinned it in place, and hand stitched it in place like I did with the collar. Moving on to the skirt. I went ahead and sewed all of these triangular bits together off camera because it was quite tedious and not very interesting, and also hemmed the bottom edge of the skirt. In general, I'm very happy with the shape, but I ran into a bit of an issue where the top does fit around my waist, but in my calculations I didn't factor in the fact that I do indeed have a butt. But that's not too big of an issue, as the skirt was a bit too long for my liking anyway, so all I'm gonna do is just cut out the excess at the top until it fits my waist nicely. Now that the skirt is the right size, I'm going to add the Rolo loops the same way that I did with the top here, and that is by sewing a strip of fabric as a lining piece and sandwiching the loops in the middle. Right now I'm trying to see the fit of the dress, and I'm noticing that the top might come a little bit too down for my liking. So what I think I'm gonna do is just cut out the lower parts of the top so that I'm left with only the two loops here, and then I will sew these pieces together like this. I started by measuring how much I needed to cut off the top and marked it with pins. In hindsight, my measurements may have been a bit off because one side of the front ended up a bit longer than the other, but it's okay, mistakes happen. Anyways, I went on doing a zigzag stitch on the edge of the top and then gathering the back of the skirt so that it would be the same size as the top. Then I sewed the parts together, going from the open center front to make sure that the front of the top and the skirt lined up nicely. The last step was to just sew in the buttons and fix a few parts with some hand stitching, and with that, it's done. I think this dress turned out really cute, and I think it's pretty close to the original sketch that I made. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to subscribe if you want to stay tuned for future sewing content. So I will see you next time. Bye bye!